Well, it launched my career because what people forget is the fact that there was not the huge network of regional companies that we have today. And the New York City Opera was the home of new works, and specifically American works. So if it hadn't happened there, it wouldn't have happened, because San Francisco did largely, well, I would say exclusively, European works, and so did the Met. So there were only three companies, because Chicago, people forget, really didn't start until '54, and it was an Italian company from the beginning. So I managed to have the good fortune to be introduced by the City Opera. And Julius was absolutely invaluable in saving Susanna in a way, because he didn't conduct the premiere. Eric Leinsdorf, who was the general director of the company for one season, conducted the actual premiere. But after that first season, they had to consider what would be left over or taken over from the repertoire into the coming season. And Julius, although it wasn't the custom, he kept Susanna in the repertoire, which meant that also, given the particular production manner of the first season, meant building a new production for it, which was expense, of course. But he had enough faith in the opera to keep it in for the second season. And then in the third season was the season you're referring to, when the opera was taken to the Brussels Fair, which meant it had a third production, something he still enjoys referring to, that it was the only new opera he ever knew of that had 3 new productions in 3 years. But it did. And Julius's hand was in every one of them, and beginning with the second season, he conducted all of them. And then subsequently he conducted the New York premiere of my Wuthering Heights, and also Miss Bronte's Wuthering Heights. And and also then he commissioned The Passion of Jonathan Wade, which was my third opera. So we had an association going back to really the beginning. I wasn't at the beginning of the City Opera, but it was fairly close to its beginnings. And Julius, of course, had been, first I think he was hired as a rehearsal accompanist there. And when I arrived on the scene, he was given only operettas to do in musicals and Fledermaus to this very accomplished young conductor, which he was. That was what he was limited to at the time. And then once he took over the company, which incidentally, I don't know whether you've had this information given to you or not, but I think it's important information. He was given the general directorship there at the urging of a committee of 4 singers who went to the board of directors and told them, we want Julius Rudel to head this company. And it was on the basis of that he was hired for the company. And then once, as general director of the City Opera, of course, he had full sway. He could do pretty much what he wanted to. But I've always thought that was the greatest possible compliment for a general director coming in and having been selected by his peers, really, and people who had worked with him, and also knew that, as someone said, he knew where all the skeletons were and what was in the closets, because he had been working in the administrative side. So my relationship with him goes back to that, and has continued off and on ever since. American opera was just an unknown genre. I mean, what was that, an American opera? There were none. And there had been, over the years, 1 or 2 at the Met, but spaced apart by 10 or 15 years. So there was no real American opera as I said, as a genre, as a kind of opera. And Julius had the idea and managed to earn the backing of the Ford Foundation to do an entire season of American operas and really display what we had on hand here that would be available to, companies that were coming up. No, on the contrary, since I've been thinking about this, it got a tremendous amount of publicity, as I recall, and the kind of publicity that you just can't find for the serious arts today, certainly opera. Time magazine had its own music editor, and Newsweek, and then there were 4 or 5 newspapers. So there was a huge possibility for publicity, and also a market for it. So I recall that the All-American season got great coverage, and also very enthusiastic coverage from the critics. I always feel very comfortable when I'm sitting close to Julius and he's conducting something of mine, when I see that black signet ring that he wears on his left little finger raised for the opera to begin, for the orchestra to begin. I feel a sense of great confidence, and that I'll experience a very satisfying production that will satisfy me as a composer and also theatrically, because he has the cardinal rule of a good opera conductor. He's a pit conductor, which means that his eye's on the stage as well as in the pit. And he is, in a sense, like the greatest opera conductors. He takes the part internally of every person on the stage. That's just enormously valuable, and you do not realize how valuable and how much you take it for granted until you see a conductor who never looks up from the pit. I've had such conductors in my time, and my basic impulse was to strangle them because I simply felt you're not part of the entity that is opera. You're not part of and yet you're integral. And Julius is, I would say, the epitome of involvement in terms of stage and pit. And of course, technically, he's excellent. That's always another thing that when I get back to seeing Julius conduct, as I did most recently, I think in '02 in Chicago. He did a Susanna again after all these years. And gee, just to see that fluid technique, and always lyrical, always with the singers, always breathing properly. Because the first conductor that introduced Susanna was of a very different stripe. He was a symphonic conductor, I think, more essentially, although he did a great deal of work in opera. But it was, to me, a less vocal approach to conducting, which I think is the sine qua non for a great opera conductor. Julius is like a converted Catholic. He's more American than any of us. And I think he embraced America and everything it stood for when he came over here as a young man. And as I said, became, in a sense, more American than we are. And yet with all the culture that he brought with him from his background and from growing up in Vienna. But you always had with him the feeling that he loved being in this country. And that, as I said, that he embraced willingly and I won't say uncritically, but anything that was American. And I always felt that he was ahead of me in American slang or anything else that would give you credibility as being an American. And as you know, he has almost no accent left. Just the slightest amount of, it's a very lovely accent, but it's hardly detectable. So I think that has a lot to do with it, and I think in a way maybe the All-American Opera season was a kind of a tribute on his part to his being taken in this country, embraced in this country, trained. And I don't know what Julius's early life was when he came over here. I do know he went, I think, to the Mannes School for his training, but I felt that this was part of his personal tribute to what the company had provided him, and the country had provided him, in the way of opportunity, and also valuing his gifts, and has continued to. It was a Ford Foundation grant again that Julius had secured and came to me when the grants were made to a number of companies around the country, and said, we would like you to do a new opera for the City Opera. Because you see, both of the first ones had initially been done in other places. Although I really consider that the premiere of Susanna had its professional premiere, certainly in New York, but it had been done at a university beforehand. But So he had this money available from the Ford Foundation to commission operas, and I was very fortunate to be chosen. And I had been working in my head on an idea for a new opera, which turned out to be The Passion of Jonathan Wade, which he was very enthusiastic about right from the beginning. And he gave it a beautiful production there, employing a very gifted set designer who was at that time kind of the talk of Broadway, Will Stephen Armstrong, who did just a brilliant set on, I suspect, a very limited budget, but it was so imaginative. And that's the kind of thing that he brought to the City Opera. It became the training ground for launching careers for young singers. And he must have had constant auditions because there were always new people being brought in. And they had a kind of a core company that had been with the company for many years, or some years at least, because you can't say many, it wasn't that old a company. But people like Tragle and Curtin, Sills, and they had a number of character singers who were on, in the company. And it was very closely knit. And yet they would bring in new people like Patricia Brooks, I remember. I had never been there before Jonathan Wade. And just brilliant dramatic and vocal talent. And she took a small role. And people worked their way up, I think, through small roles and through proving themselves that way. But there was never any lack of talent. I mean, there was a plethora of talent that he always had available. And as I said, he must have been doing, I don't know how many auditions a year to come up with that large a company of young talent. And of course, the idea of it was, from the very beginning, that it was a repertory company, not a star company. And that really appealed to artists like Norman Tragle, to Phyllis Curtin, to Beverly, to Pat Brooks, people of that ilk, who became stars without trying to be. But I know something that I think was a direct result of this attitude, that we're not a star company, we're a repertory company in the British model of theater companies. Because when Phyllis did a repeat production of Salome there, Norman Tragle, who was the star bass baritone of the company, and should have been anywhere, he took the role of the first Nazarene. Now that's really what producers today call luxury casting. But he did it to simply demonstrate, number one, he did it as an honor to Phyllis, whom he adored, but also to put on record and to make it visible that it was a repertory house in which you did a lead one night and you did a supporting role the next. And that they were all great roles.